My name is Andrew Woomer. I'm with the Clean Air Council, and I'm a Swissvale, Pennsylvania resident. The Edgar Thomson Steel Works is just a couple miles from my house. I live at the top of a hill, and especially on the bad air quality days, on the windy days, on the holidays, and times when there's oftentimes more issues at the plant in terms of emissions. A lot of that pollution blows right over my hill, right into my windows and in my house. Oftentimes we'll wake up in the middle of the night and have a bad smell, that rotten egg smell that people talk about. My spouse, she will wake up with sinus issues and headaches and things like that on particularly bad days, bad emissions days. And for myself, whenever I moved to Pittsburgh about a decade ago, started developing nose polyps in my sinuses that would, over time grew and made it difficult to breathe through my nose comfortably. Just would make common colds and runny noses and things just a lot worse than it normally would be, because I had these things in my sinuses that, from what my doctors say, is a allergic reaction to something in my environment. So, I grew up in central Pennsylvania, I'd never had an issue with it until I moved to Pittsburgh, and, I had to have sinus surgery to get them removed. So I can't say that that's because of the Edgar Thomson Steelworks, but it's, seems to be something in the air regionally. I'm generally pretty healthy, so I feel less burdened with symptoms than from what I hear about others, but it's definitely a concern for me as someone with a mostly sedentary job that I have to check the air quality alerts and, do a little bit of research and look at the purple air monitoring network and things like that to determine if it's safe to go on a run or to, go on a hike or, go spend an hour working in the yard on, my gardening projects or whatever. Like I need the exercise to stay healthy as someone who sits a lot because of the type of work that I do. And that just doesn't feel right. Outside of the infringement on our health, whenever we breathe these emissions in, it actually feels like an infringement on my like personal liberty, right? To like just walk out my door and feel like I don't have to worry about the air that I'm breathing. There's plenty of studies and research and that people can look into about how folks who walk, folks who ride their bikes, people who do outdoor exercise are like more at risk of pollutants because they're just breathing more air in larger quantities when you're exercising. I know there's folks who have worse off symptoms than I do, but it's still just a day-to-day impact on my life that I wish didn't exist. Fracking was on my radar. That was some of the first work that I did in Pittsburgh was, canvassing around. They were dumping fracking wastewater into the Monongahela River north of the city. I was working with Clean Water Action at the time. And, so fracking and things like that were on my radar, but I had just never thought of like living in a place where you have to like be conscious about the air quality. My coworker Jay has done more work around the Edgar Thomson Steel Works and the Clairton Coke Works that I have, but the Clean Air Council, supports efforts in both of those places around the plant, knocking on doors to inform folks of when permits are being renewed and to give feedback on those permits. We had a air purifier distribution effort, because folks are breathing it all the time. So like it seems like as much as the company should be doing something, getting air purifiers out to folks to make sure that their indoor air quality at least is better for them. And we've also played a role in some efforts around some of the fine money from when US Steel exceeds their emissions goes into like a local pot. And we've played a role in pushing to make sure that that money is spent equitably and not just to fill budget holes for the Allegheny County Health Department. There's just always a front to fight on when it comes to industry, whether it's the steel industry, whether it's the fracking industry that surrounds Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, and in some ways is operating in Allegheny County. And just north of that, the petrochemical industry, right? And the build out happening there in Beaver County. All of these things are obviously very connected, and there's always an issue going on. And it just really feels like everyday people shouldn't have to be dealing with the externalized costs, both financially and on our health and on our environment, that companies are, doling out. Like, I really seriously question whether or not a lot of these industries could even be profitable if it wasn't for direct or indirect subsidies, right, in the form of tax breaks or what have you, the public infrastructure wear and tear on our roads, on, whatever it may be, that, everyday usage by folks like us with our bikes and our cars, right, aren't going to tear up a road the way that like a bunch of trucks going through every day hauling, fracking wastewater or whatever. That all adds up on, becomes a financial burden for small municipalities. And then all of the healthcare, right? How many people are buying, uninsured people, including insured people, but how many people are buying inhalers and, doing something like I did where I had to, go to a series of doctor's appointments to figure out what was going on in my sinuses and then undertake a surgery that, I had to get put under for, right? Like, I'm lucky enough to have health insurance, but for someone who doesn't, that's a real financial burden. And that's what these companies aren't paying for, right? They're not paying for the wastewater treatment. They're not paying for all these little ways that they're not paying to deal with the waste and the processes of their industry. It gets put onto us collectively. So I really, really question whether or not these industries could be profitable at all if it wasn't for, them externalizing their costs every step of the way. This isn't just our region thing. If you look at the Mountain Valley pipeline, talking to the folks who've been working on that, they'll tell you that, the roads that lead to some of the pipeline construction run through farmland. And a lot of those farmers had to expand the road, right, which is paid for by municipal dollars. The company didn't pay to expand the road, but they couldn't fit their trucks on the small country roads that were there. And then farmers had to like move their fence lines in, right? So they're losing like, 10, 15 feet of their property, but the company's not paying the farmers and their time, labor, resources, materials to set their fence lines back, and to redig the ditches and those kinds of things, right? So it's all these really little, not little ways, these are significant, but if you were a farmer and didn't realize that, this company is doing it to everybody on the street, right? Or everybody in their service area or wherever they're working, it's easy to feel like, oh, it's just me, right? It's just one little mistake and I just happen to be someone who had to pay for it. And it's like, you start to zoom out, you start to visit communities across Pennsylvania who are dealing with this, and you start to realize like it's built into their business model. And that's not right. I mean, same with, I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I've been tapped into some work around the Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. In my community, there's a bridge that has been out for over a year now after the Fern Hollow Bridge in Pittsburgh collapsed and everybody started looking at bridges to see which ones were safe and not safe, and it turns out a bunch of them weren't safe. A bridge in Swissvale that connects two working class communities and two smaller business districts in Swissvale. There's a bridge that goes over a railroad line and the busway, that a rapid transit system in Pittsburgh. And this bridge was deemed unsafe. So they closed it down to everybody except for pedestrian traffic. And it's been closed for over a year. It really caused problems, like transit problems in our community, because buses can't travel over it now, right? People with mobility issues can't walk across the bridge. They have to, go out of their way. It causes traffic problems. We discovered that this bridge is Norfolk Southern's responsibility. It's their financial responsibility. The borough of Swissvale has a contract with them from like 75 years ago or something that they are obligated to maintain it. And when time came to maintain it and our borough council started pestering them about it, they kept trying to push the contract off, right? Oh, it's not legally binding anymore because it's old. And, they tried everything they could to make it seem like they don't have to pay for it. Just like last week, our borough council at our council meeting said, we're going to take responsibility over the maintenance of this bridge moving forward, but Norfolk Southern is going to pay X amount to fix it up this time around and put like X amount of money aside for future repairs. But you look at that one instance, right? And then you look at Allegheny County, and Norfolk Southern is pushing for infrastructure changes to raise bridges so that they can start running double stack trains. So two cars on top of each other carrying cargo through Allegheny County. So they want all these communities they want the county government, they want the city government and these municipal governments to put up some money to change our bridges to fit their trains from coming through, but they don't want to staff their trains appropriately so that they can catch issues like what caused the Norfolk Southern train derailment, which is like some wheels caught on fire, right? There, there's camera footage of miles and miles before the derailment that happened in East Palestine. There's video evidence that you can see wheels on fire, just like grinding across the railroad tracks. And it's like, so they're cutting costs on labor, on infrastructure, repair and management and maintenance. And then they're trying to get local governments and county governments to pay for infrastructure projects so that they can run more cargo through our towns, that we have to breathe those extra emissions. We have to deal with the extra noise. We have to worry about the risks that come with transporting 2 times the amount of goods of whatever they're carrying. And it's not just the petrochemicals and the coal and all these other things that, should they spill, they cause like a really serious health risk and safety risk. But even just a couple years ago, there was a Norfolk Southern train derailment near Pittsburgh. It was like shampoo and like Listerine, and that still devastated an area ecologically. It didn't cause health problems like, to humans, but I just saw something maybe a month or two ago where they were still figuring out how to like get Norfolk Southern to clean that area up and like do some ecological restoration. And so it's these just constant barrage of pushing costs of doing business onto communities, whether it's a railroad industry, oil and gas industry, fossil fuel industry, whatever. And it's just at a certain point, communities have to get organized and do something about it. It's happening all over Pennsylvania. There's no community you can go to where there isn't some business that's just taking and taking and taking, and putting the risks and the cost off on everybody else. Businesses don't have to operate like this. It's an active choice. And I feel like there's this culture, especially among the people who guide our economy and write the rules and regulations and things, that it's somehow built in that we should assume that someone has to get hurt. That if we pay workers enough and give them enough good benefits, then we won't be able to be profitable. That a corner has to get cut somewhere, and that's just the cost of doing business. That's not true. Like, it doesn't have to be like that. Like, we can have an economy that works for us, right? We can have economies at scale. We can have block level, neighborhood level production of a lot of the goods that we use every day, which will reduce the need for longer supply chains and these more like intensive forms of transportation. But that's not beneficial to oil and gas companies. That's not beneficial to train companies, right? And so I think it's really important for us to consider the cost of all of this business versus the cost of growing your food locally, of turning the dilapidated row homes that aren't fit for living in anymore into like a small scale farm that can feed a couple blocks worth of people, or local production of lumber, or, building material reuse, right? All of these things can happen at the neighborhood level. People don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the small scale sawmills that only cost, maybe $10,000 or something like that, proper composting infrastructure or what have you. But we can build an economy around housing and food and medicine and have most of what we need, right? Without these long consumer supply chains that just cause an innumerable amount of problems. You don't need plastic packaging, right? You can afford to have heavier packaging that's sturdier and lasts longer and doesn't, have all these problems if you only have to carry it, 1/10 the distance. Eventually, we need to start building the economy we want to see instead of relying on these larger businesses to do it for us, because they're simply not going to. There's no evidence to suggest they're going to.